My name is Rebecca Dwyer. I'm 37 years old. I'm a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army with 21 years of service and 7 spoken languages. My most fluent non-native tongue, Arabic. The irony, that same skill almost cost me the mission that changed everything. I still remember the fluorescent hum of the lights in that room, the kind that makes everything feel colder than it is. Steel table, 12 chairs, 8 of them occupied. Most faces I barely knew, except 2. One was Commander Herndon, seated at the head of the table, hunched over the satellite images with a red grease pencil. The other Daniel, my older brother, a Navy SEAL, and the last person I expected to see across from me in a joint force operation. He didn't look surprised, just disappointed. I stood at the end of the table, clicking my pen twice before speaking. My folder was open in front of me. Surveillance photos, map grids, timestamps, and enemy radio transcripts. I had spent the last 96 hours decoding messages intercepted out of Helmand Province, Afghanistan. The kind of chatter you don't need weapons to understand, just ears and language. They're not moving the hostages yet, I explained, tapping a cluster of red markings, but they will within 48 hours. If we go now quietly diplomatically, we can get all 12 men out with 0 American blood spilled. Someone cleared his throat. Another leaned forward. But it was Daniel who finally spoke, calm, cool-clipped. Talking to enemies in Arabic isn't heroic, he said. His voice cut through the room like a blade dipped in ice. Everyone went silent. Herndon looked up from the map. Sergeant Cruz blinked twice. Even the air conditioner seemed to pause. I stared at him, jaw tight. He didn't flinch. And just like that, the mission shifted. Not on paper, but in tone, in trust, in command dynamics. I was no longer the linguistics expert with classified intel. I was just the sister, the one who used words instead of weapons. To them, that sentence meant I wasn't going to pull the trigger when it counted. To Daniel, it meant I'd never be good enough to be considered a soldier. What he didn't know was this: I wasn't trying to be a soldier in his mold. I had fought battles of a different kind, and my war was never just with the enemy. It was with silence, with being dismissed, with being underestimated. I folded the map slowly, methodically, keeping my breathing steady. I don't talk to enemies, I said softly. I outthink them. Nobody responded, not a smirk, not a nod. Daniel leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. His silence said more than his sentence ever did. And I had to pretend it didn't crack something inside me. That briefing was supposed to be about the rescue of 12 American soldiers, held in a rural compound west of Lashkar. But that day, it became something else. It became the day I realized I was going to have to save those men, and prove to every person in that room, including my own brother, that language wasn't weakness. It was strategy, power, and in this case, the only way to win without killing. Daniel's eyes bored into mine until Herndon called the room back to order. We move in 36 hours. Dwyer leads intel and frontline negotiation. The murmurs started. She's negotiating with who? The Taliban. I thought this was a SEAL op. I heard every word, and I let it hang. Because I knew something they didn't. I knew I could speak the dialect spoken only by elders in that region. I knew the leader of the holding cell had a son who studied in Jordan, and I had read all his letters. I knew there was a back door to this rescue mission, and it didn't involve a bullet. But none of that mattered yet. All they saw was Daniel's sister, a woman in uniform, a folder full of words, and a plan that required trusting the one thing no one in that room believed in me. But I wasn't there to beg for faith. I was there to execute. And when the moment came, I'd speak in Arabic and make them listen. It wasn't the first time I stood in uniform without applause, but it was the first time I felt seen without a single word spoken. The promotion hall smelled like old wood and new metals. It was the kind of room where generations of officers had stood one after another, each called by name, rank, and number of years served. The same room my father once stood in back when people still saluted out of belief, not obligation. They called 3 names before mine. Men who had led in battle, men who had bled, men who had shouted orders loud enough to silence airstrikes, men like Daniel. He wasn't getting promoted that day, but he sat in the second row, spine straight, jaw tight. Right next to our father, Colonel James Dwyer, retired but still intimidating. His medals shone brighter than the chandelier. When they finally called me, I didn't walk up. Not right away. Because something happened first. A low, calm voice came from the side podium. A man I barely recognized. Navy SEAL Commander scar on his temple. I had stitched it myself with trembling hands 3 years earlier in a tent made of canvas and fear. "If you were saved by Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Dwyer," he said, voice even, "please stand." There was no movement at first, just silence. Then, one man stood, then another, then 3, 5, 9, 12 SEALs in perfect uniform rose like a tide. They didn't look at each other, they didn't shift nervously. They just stood and faced me. No words, just presence, just memory. I didn't cry, not then, not when the hall went silent. Not when a murmur swept across the crowd like wind through dry leaves. I stood slowly, my knees suddenly uncertain. I wasn't shaking because I was nervous. I was shaking because my body couldn't hold the weight of that moment. Every operation, every translation. Every time I'd spoken Arabic under breath behind enemy lines with a heartbeat like a snare drum, this was the echo. I didn't hear clapping, not even when the speaker said Rebecca Dwyer for distinguished service in Joint Force operations. I only heard my brother exhale soft like he didn't mean to. And then I looked. At him, at my father. Daniel was staring ahead unmoving, but his hands, those same hands that used to steady my bike, were clenched in his lap. And his eyes didn't carry judgment anymore. Just something else, something quieter, and our father. He didn't move, didn't clap, didn't stand, didn't speak, but his eyes didn't blink. And that silence meant more than any medal ever could. Because for once it wasn't about recognition, it was about being witnessed. By the same men who once doubted me, by the brother who once dismissed me, by the father who once told me language won't keep you alive. And now 12 SEALs were standing, not because I killed for them, but because I spoke for them. And no one, not even Daniel, could deny that anymore. My name is Rebecca Dwyer. I am a colonel in the United States Army, and I speak 7 languages, though none of them seem to matter in my father's house. I started learning Farsi from the janitor who cleaned the motor pool. He didn't speak English well, but I listened when he cursed under his breath at broken engines. I picked up Arabic from an old radio. I fixed myself. The frequencies weren't clear, but the words came with rhythm. Urdu came later, mostly from medicine labels on humanitarian boxes left in our garage after my dad's 3rd deployment. When I was 11, I started collecting dictionaries. I kept them under my bed like they were weapons. Spanish, Pashto, Somali, Dari. I'd read them with a flashlight past midnight. Not because anyone asked me to, but because every word felt like a secret I could steal from the world. Daniel, my brother, was handed a rifle at 12. He was sent to the cadet camp every summer. He came back sunburned, cocky, with a new badge each year. I stayed home. I washed the car. I ironed Dad's uniforms. I translated manuals no one read. Dad called it nerd work, said words wouldn't save lives when the bullets started flying. That was his favorite saying. Words are for the weak. He said it once while tossing my Urdu dictionary into the fireplace. I remember the way the flames licked each page as if the language was being erased from me. Daniel laughed. That night I buried the rest of my books in the backyard, lined them in plastic, and drew a map only I could read. For years I pretended I didn't care about languages anymore. But every time I heard Arabic spoken on the street, at markets, at airports, I'd translate it silently. I'd whisper back in perfect cadence. It was a secret ritual, one that reminded me I still had something no one could take. The irony was, in school they tested me for speech delays. I was quiet. Too quiet. But I wasn't mute, I was listening. I read military transcripts in 6 tongues by the time I turned 15. I could recite enemy broadcasts in real time. I could mimic accents, tones, dialects. But none of that earned me a seat at Dad's table. Daniel once brought home a medal. Everyone clapped. I brought home a United Nations language competition award. Dad shrugged. Try bringing back a kill badge next time. At 16, I took my first interpreter job, volunteer of course, shadowing aid workers in a refugee center. I never told anyone. I just showed up. And the first time I translated for a woman crying in Dari, I watched her shoulders relax as if someone had finally seen her. I didn't want medals. I wanted that. But even back then, I knew Daniel would inherit the guns. I'd inherit silence. It's strange growing up in a house where language was considered betrayal, where every time I opened my mouth in something other than English, I was met with a look like I'd spat on the flag. Yet now, years later, it's those very words that echo in briefing rooms, in deserts, in secure calls. Captain Dwyer, we need you on this one. No one else speaks their dialect. I always answer copy that. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if my father ever knew that the girl he told to stay quiet would one day make generals lean in to understand what the world was really saying. Or maybe he knew, and that's what scared him most. My brother Daniel joined the military 6 years before I did. He was celebrated like a war hero before he even stepped onto base. There was a barbecue in our backyard with American flags on every table. Family, neighbors, even his old track coach showed up to shake his hand. My father gave a toast. To the next generation of Dwyer men, he said, lifting his beer. Everyone cheered. I washed the dishes. I didn't tell anyone when I applied to ROTC. I just sent in the application, got accepted, and packed my bags quietly. There was no party, no speech. My mother squeezed my hand. My father read the letter and laid it back down like it was a grocery list. Just don't come back crying, he said. That was all. Daniel got infantry. I got linguistics. Tactical linguistic operations, to be exact. I was the youngest person in the unit, and the only one fluent in more than 4 dialects. My superiors noticed even if my family didn't. I drafted cultural immersion plans. I analyzed intercepted radio chatter. I wrote a field strategy on civil population engagement in Aleppo that the Department of Defense cited in 2 internal policy updates. My father never asked to read it. He still kept our old Winchester mounted over the fireplace. It had belonged to his father, a Marine in Vietnam. That gun was his shrine to real service. He believed wars were won with bullets, not books. He never understood how words could protect lives or save them. Daniel, on the other hand, thought silence was strength. Don't talk unless you have to, he used to say. And people listened to him. He could walk into a room and command attention without saying a word. I had to earn every second anyone gave me, but I didn't mind. Language had always been my weapon, even if they couldn't see the scars it left. I remember one family dinner. I'd just returned from a 6-month assignment, working on joint tactical drills with Kurdish translators. I mentioned something about dialectal drift in northern Iraq. My father stopped chewing. That's not real soldier talk, he said. Daniel laughed. And the room went silent. It always did after my father spoke. I tried harder after that. I volunteered for joint missions. I led debriefs. I mediated in real time during an extraction in western Syria, when a local commander was seconds away from calling in an ambush. I spoke Arabic with the confidence of someone who had grown up in 3 countries, even though I'd barely left Virginia before my commission. But none of that mattered to my father. He still called me civilian-minded. Sometimes I think he believed I joined just to compete with Daniel, but I didn't. I joined because I couldn't sit still while the world was speaking in cries for help, and no one in my house wanted to understand a word of it. Daniel never read my reports. I'm not sure he even knew which countries I had been assigned to, but I read everything he sent home. His injury report, his unit commendation, the note he left taped to the fridge after coming back from Afghanistan. Don't wait up. I kept waiting anyway. The day I got the Special Language Operations Medal, my commanding officer shook my hand and said, "You saved more lives than bullets ever could." I told my father that when I called home. He paused, then said, "Medals come easy these days." I didn't argue. Not because I agreed, but because I realized something. I was never going to be the soldier he wanted. I was becoming the soldier I needed to be. And sometimes that has to be enough. My name is Rebecca Dwyer. I was 34 when I was assigned to Jalalabad, a city I had never set foot in, but had studied for years. I had learned its dialects, its market rhythms, the tone of its prayers at dusk. The Defense Intelligence Agency wanted a linguist who could decode local militia chatter fast enough to prevent ambushes. I thought I'd be working behind a monitor detached unseen. But they dropped me into the forward operating base at the edge of the city with a uniform, a rank, and a reality I hadn't anticipated. And then I saw him, Daniel, my brother. He stood at the edge of the briefing tent, sleeves rolled, combat boots dusted in red clay. He looked like he'd been sculpted by the terrain itself, silent, resolute, worn. I hadn't seen him in almost 2 years. He didn't flinch when he saw me, just nodded and said, "They sent you, not hi. Not are you okay?" Just that one sentence, cold, dismissive. He was leading a tactical support unit. Logistics extraction weapons transport. Men respected him not because he talked much, but because he didn't need to. His record was flawless. Mine was invisible. We were briefed on the latest threat, a known cell moving supplies near Route 2B. Intel chatter suggested they were planning an IED ambush within 72 hours. My role was to intercept and translate any intercepted messages or local conversations that might pinpoint timing or targets. But I knew that wouldn't be enough. Words are not just messages. They are maps. So I mapped. I spent 19 hours listening to fragments of Pashto and Dari voices, filtered through static and fear. I tracked slang terms for routes for explosives, for weddings code for public detonations. I drew red lines on satellite maps and traced the delivery patterns of water trucks, suspecting some carried more than just water. Daniel thought it was guesswork. "These people lie in 3 languages," he muttered after my second briefing. "No," I corrected. "They lie in 1. But they hint in the other 2. He rolled his eyes. But on the 3rd night the hints became urgent. A young boy in the village market, stuttering in Arabic, sold us pomegranates and slipped a phrase between pricing. "They've marked the green vehicle, Route 2B Sunrise." I asked him to repeat it softly, switching to a less formal dialect. He didn't. He just ran. I reported it. The commanders hesitated. Daniel hesitated. "Too thin," he said. "It could be noise." "It's not," I said. "They'll hit the supply convoy." Daniel had authority. He had the power to redirect the route. He didn't. The next morning I sat on the convoy radio, and when the crackling came in, Arabic first, then Pashto, I knew I was right. Target confirmed. Green truck, first turn. I didn't wait for command approval. I grabbed the mic and spoke in Arabic. "Al-Muwaki Yugayir al-Tariq. Istadir ila al-Yasar." The marked one changes route. Turn left. There was silence. Then a voice responded. "Tamam." The green truck turned. Seconds later, the road behind it exploded. Dirt, smoke, steel. 1 vehicle disabled, but no casualties. Daniel burst into the comms tent 10 minutes later. He stared at me like he didn't know what I was. "You countermanded my order," he said. "No," I replied. "I changed the outcome." He didn't speak to me for the next 4 days. But the men did. One of the convoy drivers, an older SEAL named Morgan, brought me tea that evening. "You saved my boy," he said, eyes damp. He was in the front seat of that truck. They started listening, not just hearing my words, but listening. To the details, the timing, the breathing in the voices I translated. I stopped being the translator. I became the specialist. Daniel never acknowledged it, not in words, but one night during a fire drill, I caught him adjusting the sat phone to my frequency before walking out. That was his way. He would never call me brave, never say I'd earned it. But he started routing reports through my desk. And when I traced another planned attack 2 weeks later and led a negotiation that saved a civilian school, he didn't interrupt the briefing to correct me. He just listened. For the first time in the same war, we weren't just 2 soldiers. We were allies, even if we never said it out loud. I spotted it the moment I looked at the Overwatch grid. A second laser dot appeared on the north side of the compound just for a blink. It shouldn't have been there. We only had 1 sniper team on deployment, and they were stationed on the West Hill. I zoomed in on the feed. The signature was different, the angle was different, and then I found the source. Daniel had activated a second team, Unsanctioned. It wasn't just a violation of protocol. It was a betrayal of trust. Not just mine, but the unit's. When I confronted him, he didn't flinch. He didn't deny it. We stood outside the command tent under the desert sundust, curling around our boots like smoke. His face was still, blank. "You sent them in without clearance," I said, my voice low. He nodded. "Because if you fail, I won't." I remember staring at him like I'd never seen him before. There was no trace of doubt, no question in his tone. Just certainty. He wasn't doing it to protect me. He wasn't worried about the extraction plan failing. He was preparing to overwrite me. It wasn't the first time he'd tried. When we were kids, he used to double-check my school projects and quietly swap out my answers. At the time, I thought he was just helping, But now, under this sky, surrounded by lives that depended on my voice and not his weapon, I saw it for what it was. Daniel didn't believe I should be here, not as his equal, not even as his support. I was the variable he couldn't control. "Did you even read the message I intercepted?" I asked. "Do you know what I'll be saying to them in Arabic?" He didn't answer. His silence said enough. That night I sat alone in the mobile command center and listened to the intercepted audio again. The man we needed to reach was a tribal elder, not a combatant. He was the key to pulling 4 kidnapped aid workers out of a militant zone without a single bullet fired. But he wouldn't speak English. He wouldn't trust a man in uniform. And he wouldn't agree to negotiate with someone who came with weapons drawn. It had to be me, alone, unarmed, with nothing but words. But Daniel's backup plan ruined the neutrality. Snipers visible meant we weren't negotiating, we were threatening. It would turn the elders against us, maybe permanently. I called the snipers off. Myself. "Stand down. Orders from Lieutenant Colonel Dwyer. This is a no-fire op." They hesitated, clearly confused. I had to repeat myself twice before they withdrew. When I turned around, Daniel was watching from the ridge. We didn't speak. The next morning, I walked into the compound alone, Arabic scarf over my head. Vest stripped, hands visible. I introduced myself in Arabic. I greeted each man in their dialect Pashto, for the youngest Arabic, for the elder Farsi to the translator. I told them I had come with nothing but breath and intention, that I knew the history of their land, their culture, their grief, and that I respected it. I offered them the audio logs, proof that the aid workers had no ties to the military, that they were there for medicine and for books, not for surveillance. The elder paused. He asked me in slow Arabic, "Why should I believe a soldier speaks for peace?" And I answered, "Because I've studied more than war. I've studied your poets." Then I quoted Mahmoud Darwish. His eyes flickered, then softened. He reached for a tea kettle, poured a cup, offered it to me. That was the sign. By sundown, all 4 aid workers were released. No blood spilled, no guns raised. I returned to base to find silence. No celebration. Just Daniel alone facing a monitor with my debriefing report on the screen. He didn't turn to me when I entered. "You took a risk," he said. "I took responsibility," I replied. He closed the screen. "You're lucky it worked." I looked him straight in the eyes. "No, I'm prepared." He didn't respond. But later that night I found the sniper team logs had been amended. Someone had added a footnote request overridden. Lieutenant Colonel Dwyer protocol followed. And in the morning, one of the SEALs handed me back my scarf. Folded. Clean. "It was your op," he said. "We just followed." The air was thin and dry, the kind that scratched the back of your throat with each breath. Dust hung in the space between shadows, and the road ahead shimmered not from heat but from silence. This was the no-gun zone, 2 kilometers of open dirt between us and the gate. No cover, no UAVs, no second chances. Daniel had fought the plan to the very last briefing, citing protocols, risks optics. But protocols don't negotiate. People do. And in this case, the only language they respected was the one I had spent my entire life preparing to speak. Pashto whispered in morning broadcasts. Farsi heard through cracked windows. Arabic crammed into notebooks during midnight shifts. I wore nothing that could pass for a soldier's uniform. Just an old cotton tunic and a scarf faded by years and war. Beside me, Amin walked with the grace of someone who had done this before, a neutral interpreter, trusted by neither side and therefore may be trusted by both. We did not speak as we walked. I counted steps, recalled phrases, reviewed the tone in which I would address the gatekeeper, the honorifics I would use, the poems I would quote. Language in this place was more powerful than artillery, but it could also backfire. One wrong word could mean refusal, or worse, silence. The checkpoint appeared like a phantom. 2 men in plain robes stood behind sandbags, fingers resting on old Kalashnikovs. They did not raise them, but they did not lower their eyes either. I bowed, not deep, not submissive, just enough to signal intent. And then I said the first sentence, one I had practiced for weeks. "Salam. May I enter to speak of peace and kinship?" The elder narrowed his eyes, studied me, then turned and vanished behind the curtain. 5 minutes passed. 10. Sweat gathered behind my neck. My lips dried. Amin glanced at me, unreadable. Then, without warning, the curtain opened. A voice, gravelly uncertain, called out, "Let her through. Her tongue is not a stranger." Inside, it was cooler, darker. The compound smelled of tea and diesel. I removed my shoes, stepped onto the woven mat, and greeted them again, this time in Pashto. The next hour passed in layers: greetings, questions, memories, silences. They tested me. Stories from local villages. Questions about Quranic metaphors. Why I had learned their language. I answered all. And then I listened. When they asked why I came without a weapon, I told them because trust cannot walk with fear. At the end of it all, an elder touched his heart and said, "You are not our enemy." That was all we needed. When I stepped back across the dirt road, the wind had shifted. Behind me, the gates closed. Not in rejection, but in quiet understanding. My boots left no trace in the dust. The air smelled of metal and wood smoke, the kind that clung to grief. Rahim, our neutral translator, walked half a pace behind me, his breath steady, his silence intentional. 2 Taliban commanders sat in the battered tent before us. One was young, nervous in posture, but not in stare. The other, older, with fingers wrapped around faded prayer beads, looked at me as if I were a strange word he hadn't decided to trust yet. I didn't wait to be asked. In Arabic, I said clearly, "Ana la atlub al-sila. Atlub al-ru. I don't carry weapons. I carry life." The older man blinked, unmoved. The younger leaned forward. I kept my posture soft, my hands open, and continued in their tongue. "I'm not here to negotiate for soldiers. I'm here to speak of a child." A pause stretched long, sharp. I reached slowly into my worn folder. No sudden movements, just memory folded in half. I pulled out a photo, a girl no older than 7, face wrapped in gauze, her eyes stubbornly hopeful. Her name was Amina. "I was told not to help," I said. "It was outside our jurisdiction. She screamed for hours near your checkpoint." I logged the incident, followed protocol. But I didn't move. The older man stared hard. The prayer beads slowed. The younger one scoffed. "You expect forgiveness? No. I expect understanding." I passed the photo gently forward. 2 weeks later, I broke protocol. I got her medevac. She lived. Rahim translated, but they barely needed him. She drew this. I unfolded a crayon-stained paper, a crude helicopter, a stick figure with a red cross, a small girl waving. She said it was the lady who didn't yell. I think she meant me. The older man reached out for the drawing. For a second, his hand hovered midair, then touched paper like it was something sacred. "I remember her," he said quietly. "Farouk's daughter." I nodded. "There are things language can't cover," I said. "But sometimes it's the only bridge we have left." The younger one narrowed his eyes. "Why now? Why come unarmed?" "Because if I came armed, you wouldn't listen. And if I came with men, you wouldn't trust. You think stories save lives. I know they do." I let the silence grow roots between us. "I don't ask you to release anyone today," I said. "But I ask you to remember this child. And the ones still alive. Remember that someone came here once, not with a threat, but a truth." The older man nodded slowly. The younger one didn't move. Finally, he asked, "Will you return if invited?" He said nothing, but the elder spoke, "Return in 3 days. Alone again. Then we will talk not as soldiers, but as humans." I bowed slightly, rose, and turned to leave. As I stepped outside, the wind shifted, carrying a single word in Arabic from the elder's lips, "Nadama." Regret. I didn't reply, because this time I understood. And that finally was enough. 27 minutes later, I stepped out of the compound, the fabric flap falling behind me like a curtain on a scene no one else had witnessed. 12 Navy SEALs followed close their steps, cautious disbelief tucked in the lines of their dust-covered faces. The desert air held its breath. No gunfire, no shouted orders, no sniper shots from the ridge above, though I knew they had come close. Daniel's team never pulled the trigger, but only because I wasn't 5 minutes later. I didn't look for Daniel right away. I felt him. His presence was a weight in the silence, a question unspoken. I saw it in the way the red laser dots danced faintly across the canvas wall, just seconds before I emerged, how they suddenly vanished when I crossed the line. They had been locked on target. Me. Or maybe someone behind me. One of the SEALs glanced sideways as we walked. Anders his name was. He had blood crusted on his collar and a gash above his brow. He cleared his throat, kept his voice low. "What did you say to them?" I didn't answer immediately. My boots hit the sand like punctuation marks. Each step forward felt earned, not given. Then I turned slightly, just enough for him to hear me. "Darika," I said in Pashto. "All good." He blinked once. That was all. We didn't need more. Behind us, the gate remained open, flapping slightly in the breeze as if unsure whether to close. I didn't tell him that inside that tent, I hadn't offered strategy or threats or treaties. I offered names, real names. I reminded them of the girl near their checkpoint, who screamed for her brother after the bombing, and how I called in the medevac even when protocol said no. I told them the truth in their language. Regret offered in syllables they could feel. Sorrow shaped like their own. No translations, no lies. And when the silence inside cracked just enough, I stood and said, "We all bleed red. Let them go." And somehow, they listened. Or maybe they remembered something I'd never know. A daughter, a sister, a voice on a dusty radio. When we reached the rendezvous point, command burst into motion checklists, vitals, tactical debriefs. But I stayed behind for a moment. Daniel stood apart from the crowd, his jaw clenched, but he didn't speak. We shared a look, sharp, unspoken, unfinished. Later, by the supply tent, Anders passed me again. First time I walked out without my gun raised, he muttered. I managed a faint smile. First time I walked in without one. And that was it. No flags, no medals, no speeches, just the sand, the steps, and a silence that walked 12 men home. My name is Colonel Rebecca Dwyer. The ceremony wasn't supposed to be about me. It was to honor the fallen, the wounded, and the 12 who made it home from Jalalabad. I had planned to sit in the third row, stay silent, and leave early. That's what my father would have preferred. No spotlight, no speeches, just dignity and distance. But fate has a strange way of folding back on itself, like a map that refuses to forget where it's been folded too many times. The auditorium was packed. Rows of uniforms, rows of medals, rows of polished boots that had walked through hell and back. There were no posters, no confetti, just the quiet echo of memories. No one wanted to say aloud. Daniel sat in the front row with his unit posture, straight jaw locked. He looked like a statue carved out of the same stone our family legacy was built from, hard, unmoved, immovable. I was 2 rows behind, between a nurse I'd trained in Kandahar and an old communications officer I hadn't seen in 8 years. Neither knew what I'd done. That's how I wanted it. Until the nameless began. One by one, names of SEALs were read, each one followed by the word survivor. Then their rank, then silence. No claps, no cheers. Just acknowledgement. Then the man at the podium, General Stratton, cleared his throat. "There's one name," he said, "that isn't on your programs." Because her role wasn't expected to matter. And yet 12 men walked back because of her. I looked down, pretending to check my watch. She walked into enemy ground. No sidearm, no cover, no backup. Just language and belief. I froze. Stratton didn't say my name, not yet. But I felt a shift in the room. Like someone had pulled the safety off memory. She didn't pull a trigger. She didn't lead a charge. But she made 12 chairs at this ceremony occupied today. Then he turned. His hand lifted slightly. "If she saved your life, please stand." No sound followed. Just air tightening. Seconds thickened. And then 12 men rose. Not in unison, not like a drill. But one by one, each of them stood. SEALs, combat veterans. Men who once kicked doors down in synchronized breath. They stood for me. They didn't look at the podium. They didn't look at Stratton. They looked at me. I didn't breathe. The nurse beside me turned. The comms officer whispered something I didn't register. 12 men all alive because I said Anala Atlub al-Sila, Atlub al-Ru. I do not bring weapons. I bring life. My eyes scanned toward Daniel. He was still seated. His arms crossed, his gaze lowered. A flicker in his jaw, maybe tension, maybe shame. But he didn't move. I didn't expect him to. Then movement in the back row. I turned, heart still pounding. Colonel James Dwyer, my father. He stood. Slowly, deliberately. He didn't clap. He didn't nod. But he looked at me. Not through me, not past me. At me. It was not pride in his eyes, nor apology. It was understanding. And for him that was louder than any medal he'd ever pinned on another man. Stratton let the silence stay, then nodded once and moved on. No one called my name, no certificate was handed over, but for the first time I wasn't invisible, not to them, not to him, not to myself. I sat down again, not because the moment ended, but because it began. He didn't blink. He stood just like the others, but it was not because of some ceremonial instinct or obligation. No, my father stood not out of applause, not out of pride. He stood because something in him had shifted. And he didn't blink because blinking might have broken it. The silence in the hall stretched into something sacred. 12 SEALs had risen moments before without hesitation. Each one stood as if obeying a deeply personal command. They didn't glance at one another. They didn't look at the podium. They looked at me. And now my father stood too, alone in his kind, different from them yet moved by the same unseen force. I had waited my entire life to hear him say, "I'm proud of you," but he never had. And in that moment, I realized I didn't need those 4 words anymore. His silence, shaped by decades of withheld approval, was now filled with something weightier than any phrase. He didn't blink, but I did. Just once. Because I saw it something raw behind his stillness. Maybe it was understanding. Maybe it was sorrow for years he could never rewind. Maybe it was simply the inability to remain seated, while a truth unfolded in front of him. This wasn't a story told in words. This wasn't a story where the father hugs the daughter and the orchestra swells. This was a military ceremony, and I was a soldier, and he was a soldier. And this moment, this non-verbal exacting moment, was the most honest communication we had ever shared. I remembered when I first came home from Aleppo, sunburnt and thinner, with a flash drive full of intelligence that changed the course of a regional operation. I left it on his desk, with a note. "Thought you might want to know what I've been doing." He never said a word, not then, not after. The drive remained untouched for weeks. I took it back eventually. That was his way. Now he was standing. My brother Daniel didn't move. His jaw tightened. His hands remained folded across his lap. I saw the flicker in his eyes, the kind you see when someone is caught between disbelief and discomfort. He had always seen himself as the one worthy of our father's approval. He had earned it through grit, through visible command. I had earned it through things, invisible codes, cracked bridges, built lives saved. But to some those things didn't weigh the same. The announcer moved on. More names, more medals, more units honored. The room breathed again, but something in me held still. When the last trumpet call echoed across the room, I remained in my seat. I didn't look for my father. I didn't need to. His presence had already become part of my atmosphere. Growing up, my father once said to me, "Respect isn't given, it's recognized." At the time, I thought it meant I had to prove myself twice as hard because I was his daughter and not his son. But maybe, just maybe, it meant that he wasn't capable of giving it freely. It had to be summoned from within him. And now it had been. I stood slowly as the crowd began to disperse. The hush had given way to the shuffle of medals, boots, and murmured congratulations. A general passed me and offered a nod. Nothing grand, just acknowledgement. I returned it. Then I turned and met my father's gaze again. He had returned to his seat, but he hadn't looked away. His arms rested on his knees, hands clasped. He stared at me as though trying to memorize the person he had somehow missed watching grow. For a brief moment, I wanted to walk toward him, to say something, to invite a conversation that had been a lifetime deferred. But I didn't, because this was enough. His gaze didn't soften, it didn't harden, it simply existed. And I understood. I thought about the language of silence. It had been his first language, and for too long I had tried to speak it better than him. Now I had outgrown it, not abandoned it, transcended it, turned it into something new. I remembered being 10, overhearing him tell a colleague, "Rebecca's sharp, but she'll never make it through combat protocol." He wasn't being cruel, he was being what he thought was honest. But I did make it. I had survived everything the world threw at me, and I returned with more than scars. I returned with conviction, with fluency in 7 languages, with 12 lives behind me that bore witness to what I did with empty hands and unarmed resolve. And now I had one more thing. A father who stood, not because someone told him to, not because the protocol demanded it, but because in that singular, irreversible moment he finally saw me. He didn't blink. And I didn't flinch. That was our language now. And for the first time in my life, I was fluent. After the ceremony, I returned to my temporary lodging, a quiet military compound still smelling faintly of oil and old canvas. The dust on my boots hadn't settled yet, but the internet had already erupted. An anonymous message blinked on my screen. That was staged. You didn't rescue anyone. You talked. No name, no signature. Just the sharp edge of disbelief hiding behind a signal bounced through 3 proxy servers. I stared at it for a full minute, unmoving. The cursor pulsed underneath the sentence like a slow heartbeat. I could have responded. I could have sent them the logistics report, the sealed debriefing logs, the radio transcripts. But what good would facts do when someone had already chosen their version of the story? The next morning, one of the soldiers from the tactical support unit posted on his private account, "Words won't stop bullets." And below it, a hashtag started to form. No hero without gunfire. By noon, it had spread to message boards, private group chats, veteran threads. It wasn't a coordinated attack, it was more insidious. It was a shared belief, one that ran deeper than strategy or field intel, one that questioned whether the presence of language of mercy had any place among soldiers with steel nerves and scorched earth memories. A headline on a fringe blog read, "The SEALs stood for sentiment, not strategy." I didn't respond. I didn't draft a statement. I didn't defend the truth with louder noise. Instead, I went to the audio archive and retrieved the recording. 1 minute and 29 seconds barely audible under the whir of a ceiling fan and the low hum of breath on both sides of a table. The original Arabic, my voice calm, Amal la tahmil, al-sila tahmil al-rahma. Hope doesn't carry weapons. Hope carries mercy. I posted the file, nothing else. No hashtags, no captions, just the sound of diplomacy at work where no one had believed it could exist. By evening, the comments began to shift. Slowly, some angry, some confused. But a few asked to translate. A few others asked to listen again. I received a message from a journalist embedded with the unit during that week. He wrote, "I never saw your face, but I remember the hush on the line when you walked in alone. We waited holding our breath. You didn't come out with victory. You came out with people the Pentagon didn't call. Neither did the base commander, but an interpreter I had once trained in Kuwait sent me a voice note. They say you didn't fight," she said, her voice cracking. "But you fought to be heard. That's harder." Daniel didn't message. He didn't comment. He didn't click like or share. But I knew he saw it. He was always watching. At Oro 300, I stood by the window. The stars over Jalalabad were sharp enough to slice open the sky. The compound was quiet, and my hands, those same hands that once shook while writing my first report, were steady now. I thought of my father. I thought of the times he said language was a crutch, not a weapon. And I thought of the 12 SEALs who stood, of the silence that followed, of the truth that refused to shout. I didn't need to win the internet. I didn't need applause from strangers. What I needed, I already had a room full of men who knew I brought them home. And one sentence spoken in a language most Americans never bothered to learn that traveled farther than any bullet ever could. Actually, somehow that was enough. The knock was soft. Not uncertain, just soft, like someone trying to announce their presence without demanding it. I knew it was him before I opened the door. Daniel stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the ceiling above me as if it could explain what he was about to say. He didn't cross the threshold right away. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired that came from sleep deprivation, but the exhaustion of navigating things that had no manual like siblings at war, or words that meant more than bullets. I stepped aside. He entered but didn't sit. Instead, he stood near the far wall, the one with the single window, and watched the outside like it might offer him better company. 3 minutes passed. Exactly 3. I counted them because I didn't want to be the first to speak. Finally, he turned toward me, jaw tight. "Don't you feel guilty?" he asked. "If they had shot you, what then?" His voice wasn't loud, but it hit me like gunfire. Not because it questioned my decision, but because it came from someone who once taught me how to speak with conviction. Daniel didn't fear violence. He feared silence after violence. I held his gaze and answered with a calm that surprised even me. "If no one believes in words," I said, "then guns will never fall silent." He looked down, not in shame, but in search of something he could hold on to: logic, anger, anything. But there was nothing in that moment except the weight of having witnessed something he couldn't explain and perhaps didn't want to. "I get it," he finally said, almost reluctantly. "You brought them home, but you gambled. You gambled your life. You gambled ours." I nodded. "Yes. But I gambled because no one else would. And sometimes peace only happens when someone is willing to walk into the noise, carrying silence." He didn't argue. He didn't nod either. He just stared at me, as if trying to reconcile two versions of the same person: the analyst he once called a civilian in uniform, and the woman who now stood with a dozen silent warriors behind her. There was another pause, longer this time. He walked to the door. His hand rested on the handle, but he didn't open it just yet. Then, without looking at me, he said, "For the first time, Dad looked at you and didn't see Mom. He didn't mean it cruelly. He meant it as a shift, a tectonic one. Because for years in our father's eyes, I was just an echo of the woman he lost. A shadow following a legacy I couldn't compete with. But now, after Jalalabad, after the ceremony, after 12 men stood when no one expected them to, I had become something else, something only I could be." He left without another word. And I stood there for a while, not thinking, not feeling, just listening to the silence he left behind. It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't uncertain. It was simply acknowledgement. And that from Daniel was louder than any medal. The invitation came in the form of a calendar update, sterile, efficient, and with no room for discussion. Internal Review Officers Circle. 0900 hours. Conference Room 7A. I knew what it meant. It wasn't disciplinary, but it wasn't ceremonial either. It was the military's version of holding its breath. I entered the room to see 11 high-ranking officers seated in a semicircle, flanked by aides, who typed in silence. No introductions, just nods. The chair of the circle, Lieutenant General Melrose, began without delay. "We're here to evaluate the recommendation for advancement regarding Colonel Rebecca Dwyer. There is a proposal on the table to delay elevation due to concerns over media optics and operational precedence." He paused. "This is not a vote. This is clarity." The term media optics hung in the air like smoke from a controlled burn, designed to cleanse, not to destroy, but suffocating nonetheless. Major General Singh, the logistics commander from the eastern sector, leaned forward. "Sir, I understand we've received conflicting narratives. The operation in Jalalabad, some say it was negotiation. Others say it was tactical passivity. Some call it heroism. Others say she just talked. That word again." Before I could respond, not that I was expected to, General Melrose raised one hand. "Let's ask a different question. How many lives were saved because of her decision?" Silence. Then from the back, Brigadier General Reyes answered clearly, 12. 12 active duty SEALs. Another general, one I barely recognized from Intelligence Command, shifted in his seat. "And were there any American casualties?" "None," came the answer. "Was any weapon discharged?" "No, sir." Melrose closed his folder. "Thank you. That was it. No debates, no citations, no recounting of the hours I spent preparing the tribal dialects or mapping out the no-gun path. No mention of the convoy that never had to be deployed. Just numbers. 12 and 0. The meeting adjourned in 4 minutes. A few officers nodded as they stood. Others avoided eye contact. No one raised a hand in protest. As I walked out, the air felt different, not warm, not cold, just lighter. Bureaucracy had spoken in its clearest form. Silence, when uninterrupted by objection, becomes a verdict. Back at my quarters, I didn't celebrate. I didn't even sit down right away. I just stood by the window watching the flag outside shift gently in the wind. 12 men walked out of that prison because I chose a different route, a quieter one. That day I learned that sometimes recognition doesn't come with applause. It comes with the absence of resistance. And in military rooms where dissent is expected, 4 minutes of stillness says more than any speech ever could. The letter arrived 6 weeks after the ceremony. No return address, no signature. Just a folded piece of cream paper handwritten in trembling strokes and sealed in a plain envelope. At first I assumed it was another anonymous message, another hashtag or accusation scribbled on paper. But when I opened it, something about the uneven lines and hesitant curves stopped me cold. It was written in Pashto, not in calligraphy, not by a native hand. The script was cautious, as if every letter had been relearned, retraced. I read it aloud slowly, sounding out each syllable, Zmat Saruna Ba Ta'a Saravi. My gratitude will always be with you. I held the paper in both hands and sat down. For a moment, I wasn't in my office. I was back on that long, dust-caked path leading to the Taliban compound. The air was thick, the world quiet except for the crunch of my boots and the soft muttering of my interpreter. No weapons, no guarantees, just my voice and the hope that words, simple words, would hold more power than a trigger. That day, I didn't speak perfect Pashto. I spoke softly, intentionally, respectfully. I recited phrases I had practiced for months, some picked up from BBC Afghanistan, others from linguists who believed in what they called cultural bridging. I wasn't fluent, but I was understood. That was enough. The letter, I realized, wasn't about fluency. It was about effort. It was written by one of the 12 men who had walked out with me that day. Walked out alive, unshot, unscarred. His Pashto wasn't native either. He was an American. He had taken the time to learn those few words just to say thank you in the only language he thought might matter most. I framed the letter. I placed it right beside my very first medal. Not one earned through combat or commanding fire, but through negotiation, through trust, through the sheer stubborn refusal to let silence speak louder than connection. Most visitors to my office glance at the framed medal's commendations, maybe the folded flag in the shadow box. But a few pause at the letter. They tilt their heads trying to read it. What does it say, they ask? And I answer. It says everything that bullets cannot. I never met the man who wrote it. I don't need to. I know enough. He learned a language not his own just to say something the world forgets too easily, that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it walks 2 kilometers without a rifle. Sometimes it asks for life, not surrender. My father came to visit a month after I hung the frame. He stood before the letter longer than he did any of the medals. When he turned to me, his voice was low. You still can't speak it fluently, can you? No, I admitted. But you made yourself heard. Yes. He nodded. Then, to my surprise, he stepped closer to the letter, traced the words with his finger, not touching the glass, but hovering as if memorizing them by proximity. You know, he said, when you were 10, you once told me that words would be your weapon. I didn't believe you then. And now he didn't answer right away. Then simply, now I know why they feared your silence. The letter reminded me that the legacy we leave isn't just medals or memories. It's the spaces we change, the assumptions we challenge, the languages we try to speak even poorly because someone else's safety depends on our effort. I've received many honors over the years, some with ceremonies, some with citations. But that letter, fragile and barely legible, is the only one I look at daily. Not because it's grand, because it's human. It reminds me that every life saved began with a sentence uttered in faith. That language can cross lines, bullets never will. It sits in my office framed and quiet. A reminder that I was once heard not for the rank on my collar or the steel in my voice, but for the humility in my words. And that somewhere out there, a man I walked beside now walks free and fluent in gratitude. My father has never said the words, I'm sorry, not once. Not in the heated years of my youth when silence weighed more than his belt. Not when I left for basic training without a goodbye. Not even after the ceremony where 12 men stood for me and he finally stood too. But words aren't the only language. He came to my farewell, my final send-off from the 412th. He hadn't RSVP'd. He didn't text or call ahead. He just appeared standing in the back with his veteran's cap pulled low and his arms folded across a chest that had always been broader in presence than in affection. The room was full. Officers enlisted my team. Even Daniel quiet in his tailored blues. There were medals gleaming on jackets and glass frames of commendation lining the hall. But my father was the only one in civilian clothes. He looked smaller somehow. Older. Maybe because for once he wasn't standing above anyone. Just among. After the final speech, I shook hands, accepted hugs, and signed a few flags. Then I turned and he was there. He didn't hug me. He didn't even smile. He extended his hand. Firm, direct, deliberate. "Major Dwyer," he said. "Not Rebecca, not my daughter, just Major Dwyer." And that was enough. I took his hand. And in that single moment, the years peeled back the shouted commands, the slammed doors, the scraped knees ignored. All the ways he had tried to turn me into something harder than I was. And all the ways I had refused. He held my hand longer than needed. Just a few seconds, but I felt it, the tremor of withheld grief, the tension of unspoken pride, the unfamiliar gentleness in calloused fingers. That wasn't a handshake. That was an apology in his native tongue. He didn't look at me after, just turned to Daniel, offered the same handshake, and said, "Take care of her." Then he left, no fanfare, no speech. Just an old man with a slow gait disappearing into a sunlit corridor. People asked me afterward if I was disappointed that he hadn't said more. I wasn't. When someone's language has always been silence, volume is not the measure of sincerity. That night I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years. Inside was a photo of me at 12, standing in front of a mirror in a too large army jacket. Behind me, blurred and almost out of frame, was my father, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. I used to think he didn't want the picture taken, that he didn't want to be part of that moment. But now, I wonder, maybe he just didn't know how to stand beside something soft, something untrained, something untested. Maybe he feared what I might become if I stayed gentle. And now maybe he's proud of who I became because I didn't listen. Daniel didn't say much after the ceremony either. On the ride back, he just looked at me and said, "He didn't call you by name." "No," I said. "He called me by rank." We both understood what that meant. For my father, calling me by rank wasn't a formality. It was an admission, an acknowledgement, a title earned, not inherited. He had spent most of my life denying the value of what I chose, diplomacy, language communication, over brute force. But in the end, when he had only one word to offer, he chose the one I fought hardest to make mine. Major. I framed that title. Not on a plaque, but in memory. In that quiet hallway, with his fingers shaking slightly from age and his voice finding the right word at last. Not out of love, not out of obligation, but out of respect. I don't need my father to say he was wrong. I don't need an apology carved in marble or painted in regret. I needed him to see me, and now he has. When people ask what changed between us, I say nothing, but also everything. Because sometimes the languages we never spoke are the ones that carry the most meaning when finally whispered. I was leading a letter-writing workshop at the refugee center on the outskirts of Arlington. The room smelled faintly of cumin and pencil shavings. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, humming above the voices of displaced children writing to people they could no longer reach. We had given them simple prompts. Write a letter to someone you miss. Some wrote to uncles, others to brothers, a few to friends lost on the road between borders. And one girl, Amal, no older than 10, stared at her paper unmoving. I knelt beside her, careful not to intrude. Her curls framed her face like parentheses. Her pencil hadn't moved. She looked up at me, her eyes the kind that carry the weight of too many silent nights. Then she asked in practiced English, "Miss Rebecca, is there a word in English for telling someone who died that you're still waiting?" I paused. I've spoken on military frequencies. I've briefed generals, translated ceasefires, whispered peace through foreign tongues. But I didn't have a word for what she asked, not in English. So I said gently, "Write in the language you feel strongest in." Her eyes glistened. She bent over her paper, and her hand began to move slowly at first, then with certainty. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, she handed me the letter. Written in Arabic, carefully shaped despite the trembling of youth. I translated it quietly, word for word. "Baba, I know the mountains took you, but I sit by the window every morning, and I still wait. I tell the others you're coming. I don't care that they don't believe me. I believe me. Come back when the wind stops. Or send it to kiss my forehead. I will always be your daughter." I blinked. Not to cry, but to memorize. That was a language no military manual ever taught me. No translation software could capture its heartbeat. Later that night, I typed her letter again, both versions, Arabic and English, and printed it with her permission. I placed it next to my framed commendations, not for display, for a reminder. Because I've come to believe some of the strongest things we say are not in English. Some aren't in words at all. When I left the refugee center that evening, the sky was orange with the promise of rain. I walked alone, hands in my pockets, heart carrying a letter I hadn't written, but which somehow felt like mine too. I thought of my own father, of things never said. I thought of Daniel, of what he still holds back. I thought of myself and the languages I still refuse to speak: pride, forgiveness, grief. Maybe in some ways I am still Amal, still writing to a silence, still waiting for a reply from someone who may never return. And maybe that's what courage is. Not waiting for the words to come, but choosing to speak anyway. I was never trying to prove I was a soldier. That was never the mission. I didn't carry maps of valor or chase medals. I carried conversations. I chased understanding. Even when the world demanded uniforms and firepower as proof, I stayed with words. And I waited for them to matter. People still ask me, why didn't you shoot? Why didn't you bring backup? Why didn't you let the men speak for you? The truth is, I wasn't there to echo orders. I was there to make space for voices that had never been heard, because not all battles are won with gunfire. Some are won in rooms where your voice is the only thing not shaking. And sometimes you speak not because it's safe, but because silence has cost too much. I never needed to prove I belonged in that uniform. I needed them to listen, not to my credentials, not to my bloodline, but to my language. The one I carried through my mother's lullabies, through whispered Arabic in crowded tents, through coded messages that saved lives, not with threats, but with truth. And now I turn to you. Yes, you listening to my story. Have you been quiet in your own language? Have you let someone else define what only you can name? Have you traded your truth for approval, your voice for safety? Maybe no one has told you this before, but your story, in whatever language it lives, deserves to be heard. You don't need a stage. You don't need a badge. You don't need anyone's permission. You just need the courage to speak the first word. Because language doesn't save people, but without language, no one gets saved. So speak, even if your voice cracks, even if it comes out slow, imperfect, too soft. Speak, even if they don't understand yet, even if the only one who hears it is you. Because speaking isn't just communication. It's resistance. It's reclamation. It's survival. I was never silent because I had nothing to say. I was silent because I thought no one would listen. But once I spoke, truly spoke, the world didn't just hear me. It changed. 12 men stood. My father didn't blink. A little girl wrote to her missing father in Arabic, and I translated. No act of violence, no command post, just words. And now it's your turn. Not to be loud, not to be famous, just to be real. Before we say goodbye, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night? Where stories like this keep you company in the silence, let us know in the comments. We read everyone not with eyes alone, but with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to this channel. Not just for more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Wherever you are, I hope you carry this story with you and remember sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care and speak again soon.